The silence was the first thing they noticed. It was February 19th, 1847. 7 men stood on a ridge overlooking a frozen lake in the high Sierra Nevada mountains of California. They were rescuers, men who had marched for weeks through chest-deep snow, risking their own lives to find a group of emigrants who had vanished off the face of the earth months earlier. Below them, the world was buried. The snow was 20 feet deep, covering trees, boulders, and trails in a seamless blanket of white. There was no movement. No smoke rose from the chimneys of the cabins they knew were supposed to be there. There was no sound of children playing, no barking of dogs, no lowing of cattle, just the wind hissing through the pine needles. One of the rescuers, a man named John Rhodes, shouted into the void, "Hello! Is anyone alive?" His voice died in the cold air. No answer. Fear gripping their hearts, the men descended the ridge toward the snowdrifts. As they got closer, they realized they were walking on top of the cabins. The snow was so deep it had completely swallowed the structures. Then they saw a hole dug into the snowbank, a ramp leading down into the darkness. Rhodes slid down the ramp and pushed open a makeshift door. The smell hit him first. It was a thick, cloying stench of rot, unwashed bodies, and death. Inside the gloom, huddled under mounds of filthy quilts, were creatures that barely looked human. They were skeletons wrapped in skin, their eyes wide and staring, stripped of all emotion save for a primal, animalistic hunger. A woman, so frail she could not stand, lifted her head. She looked at the 7 strangers standing in the light of the doorway, weeping. In a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping together, she asked the question that would haunt the American West for generations. "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about ordinary people, farmers, teachers, businessmen, and children who made a series of small mistakes that compounded into an unimaginable nightmare. It is the story of the American dream curdling into an American apocalypse. This is the true story of the Donner Party. To understand how they ended up in that frozen hell, we have to go back to the beginning, when the world was warm and full of promise. The year was 1846. America was in the grip of manifest destiny, the fervent belief that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion across the entire North American continent. The newspapers in the East were filled with dazzling reports of California. They called it a paradise of perpetual spring, where the soil was so rich you barely had to work it, and where a man could reinvent himself. In Springfield, Illinois, 2 brothers heard this call, George and Jacob Donner. They were not the typical desperate pioneers. George was 62 years old, a wealthy and respected farmer. He had a large estate, a loving wife named Tamsin Donner, and a house full of children. By all rights, he should have been settling into a comfortable retirement. But the fever of the West had taken hold of him. He wanted to build a legacy for his children in a new land. Tamsin Donner was a force of nature in her own right. A former school teacher, she was barely 5 feet tall, but possessed an iron will. While other women packed cooking pots and sewing kits, Tamsin Donner packed books, watercolors, and school supplies. She intended to open a school for girls in California. Joining the Donners and Reeds were families from all over, the Breens, the Eddies, the Murphys, the Kessebergs. In total, 87 people would eventually link their fates together. For the first few months, the trip was idyllic. They followed the well-worn Oregon Trail. Children ran alongside the wagons. Men hunted buffalo, and at night they gathered around campfires to sing songs and dream of the Pacific Ocean. But there was a ticking clock that everyone was aware of, though few feared it yet: the Sierra Nevada. The rule of the trail was simple. You had to be over the mountain pass before Halloween. If the snow fell while you were still on the eastern side, the mountains became a wall of death. They were making good time. They should have made it. But at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, James Reed found a book. It was titled The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by a young, ambitious lawyer named Lansford Hastings. In the book, Hastings promoted a new route, a shortcut that went south of the Salt Lake Desert. He claimed this route, which became known as the Hastings Cutoff, would shave 300 miles off the journey. 300 miles meant saving weeks of travel. To James Reed, a man obsessed with efficiency and speed, it sounded perfect. But there was a catch. Lansford Hastings had never actually traveled the full route before he wrote the book. He had drawn a line on a map and assumed it was passable. At Fort Laramie, an old mountain man named James Kleiman, who had just ridden the route on horseback, warned Reed, "It is barely a trail. It has canyons and deserts. Stick to the old road. It is longer, but it is safe." Reed listened, but he did not hear. Blinded by his own confidence and the allure of the shortcut, he persuaded the group to take the risk. On July 19th, at the Little Sandy River, the wagon train split. Most emigrants turned right toward the established Fort Hall route. The Donner Reed party turned left toward the Hastings Cutoff. Almost immediately, the shortcut turned into a nightmare. The terrain was rugged and untamed. They spent days hacking a road through Weber Canyon, moving boulders and chopping down trees just to move the wagons a few miles. The smooth road Hastings promised was a tangle of brush and precipices. It took them weeks to cover distance that should have taken days. The cattle began to wear down. Tempers began to flare. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had written that the desert crossing was 40 miles, a difficult but manageable 2-day drive. In reality, it was 80 miles of blistering salt and alkali mud. As the wagons trundled onto the white expanse, the wheels broke through the salt crust and sank into the gummy mud beneath. The oxen panicked. The water ran out. For 6 days and nights, they slogged through a white hell. Mirages danced on the horizon, taunting them with visions of lakes that didn't exist. Mothers dabbed vinegar on their children's tongues to keep their mouths moist. By the time they staggered out of the desert on the other side, the damage was catastrophic. 36 oxen had run off or died. James Reed had to abandon his magnificent palace car. The group was no longer a cohesive unit. It was a collection of desperate, angry families, suspicious of one another and terrified of the future. They had lost weeks of precious time. It was now October. The aspen trees were turning yellow, the air was growing crisp, and the Sierra Nevada still loomed ahead. The social fabric of the group began to unravel. On October 5th, while climbing a sandy hill near the Humboldt River, a fight broke out between a popular teamster named John Snyder and James Reed. Snyder, frustrated and exhausted, began whipping his oxen violently. When Reed intervened, he turned the whip on him. In a blur of violence, Reed drew his hunting knife and stabbed Snyder in the chest. Snyder died within minutes. The camp was in an uproar. Some wanted to hang Reed on the spot. Instead, they chose a punishment that, in the wilderness, was nearly a death sentence: banishment. Reed was forced to leave his wife and children behind and ride ahead, alone and unarmed, into the unknown. Leaderless and demoralized, the rest of the party limped toward the mountains. The oxen were skeletons, the people were starving, but they were close. By late October, they reached the foot of the pass. They were only a few days' journey from the summit. If they could just get over the top, they would be in California. But the sky was turning a bruised, heavy gray. On October 31st, the forward section of the party reached Truckee Lake, a calm body of water sitting in the shadow of the imposing granite peaks. They camped for the night, planning to cross the pass the next morning. That night, it began to rain in the valley, but up on the pass, it began to snow. When they woke the next morning, the ground was white. They tried to push the wagons up the slope, but the wheels slipped on the ice. The oxen, weak from hunger, refused to move. The snow began to fall harder, thick, heavy flakes that blinded them and buried the trail. Desperate, they abandoned the wagons and tried to walk, dragging their children through the drifts. But the snow was already 5 feet deep. It was soft and powdery. They sank to their chests with every step. Defeated, exhausted, and terrified, they turned back to the lake. They took shelter in a few crude cabins left by previous travelers. The Donner families, lagging behind with broken wagons, were trapped 5 miles further down at Alder Creek. They didn't even have cabins. They huddled under tents made of quilts and buffalo robes. That night, the storm truly unleashed its fury. It snowed for 8 days straight. When the sun finally came out, the pass was buried under 20 feet of snow. The trap had snapped shut. 81 souls were imprisoned in the white wilderness, with little food, no way forward, and no way back. November turned to December. The cattle that hadn't frozen to death were slaughtered and eaten. Then they ate the dogs. Then they boiled the ox hides, the roofs of their cabins, into a glue-like paste that choked them as they swallowed it. They caught mice. They chewed on pine bark. Starvation is a cruel and slow killer. It begins with gnawing hunger, then lethargy. The body begins to consume itself, breaking down fat, then muscle, then organs. Hallucinations set in. Mothers watch their babies wither away, unable to produce milk to feed them. By mid-December, a group of 15 of the strongest emigrants, 10 men and 5 women, decided to make one final attempt to cross the pass on makeshift snowshoes. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They climbed into the snow-choked wilderness, carrying only 6 days of starvation rations. They would be gone for 33 days. What happened out there on the ice and back in the bark, smoke-filled cabins at the lake would test the very limits of human morality. As the hunger became unbearable and the first people began to die, the survivors were different with a choice that no human being should ever have to make: to die with their humanity intact, or to consume the flesh of the dead to survive. The taboo was about to be broken, and the horror was just beginning. The date was December 16th, 1446. In the snow-buried cabins at Truckee Lake, 60 people were slowly dying. The cattle were gone. The families were boiling hides, catching mice and chewing on pine twigs to trick their stomachs. Hope was fading with the winter light. Desperate to save their families, 15 of the strongest emigrants, 10 men and 5 women, decided to break out of the lake basin and up toward the pass. They fashioned crude snowshoes out of oxbows and rawhide strips. They packed 6 days of starvation rations, small bits of dried beef. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. Among them were 2 fathers, William Eddy and Franklin Graves, who kissed their wives and starving children goodbye, promising to bring back help. 2 Native American guides, Luis and Salvatore, led the way. They climbed out of the lake basin and up toward the pass. It was a grueling ascent. The air was thin and their bodies were weak from malnutrition, but they made it over the summit. For a moment, looking west toward the Sacramento Valley, they felt a surge of triumph. But they had underestimated the mountains. The descent was a labyrinth of canyons and deep drifts. They lost the trail. Their food ran out on the 6th day. For 2 days they stumbled forward with nothing to eat. Then, on Christmas Day, a massive blizzard struck. The Christmas storm raged for days, pinning them down in an exposed camp. They huddled together under a single blanket, the snow piling up over them as the fire hissed and died. It was here, in what they would later call the Camp of Death, that the last vestige of civilization stripped away. Antonio, a Mexican herder, died first. Then Franklin Graves, the older father, passed away in the arms of his weeping daughters. Then Patrick Dolan went mad with hunger, stripped off his clothes in the freezing wind, and died. The survivors were trapped. The storm howled around them. They were literally burying themselves in the snow to stay warm. But the hunger was a physical agony, a sharp pain that clouded their minds. Someone spoke the unspeakable. Franklin Graves, before he died, had told his daughters to use his body to survive. He knew what was coming. At first, they refused, but as the days passed and death stared at them all, the survival instinct overrode the moral code. With trembling hands, the survivors used a knife to cut the flesh from the bodies of their friends and family. They roasted it over a small fire. The taboo was broken. Human flesh gave them the strength to stand, but it came with a heavy psychological toll. The Native American guides, Luis and Salvatore, refused to eat it. Terrified that they would be the next victims, they slipped away into the woods. The group, now fueled by the dead, pressed on. Days later, William Eddy found the 2 guides lying in the snow, exhausted and near death. But the horror had not ended. Another member of the party, William Foster, shot both Luis and Salvatore in the head. They were eaten too. Of the 15 who set out, only 7 survived to reach the first settlement in California. They looked like walking corpses. When they stumbled into a ranch on January 17, 1847, the people there wept at the sight of them. But their message was delivered. There are families trapped in the mountains, and they are dying.
Back in California, James Reed, the man who had been banished, had not been idle. He had been frantically trying to raise a rescue party, but the war with Mexico and the deep snow had stalled him. Now, with the news from the forlorn hope, the urgency was undeniable. A rescue party was formed. 7 men, led by Aquila Glover and Reeson Tucker, loaded backpacks with dried beef and flour. They couldn't take horses. The snow was too deep. They had to walk. It was a suicide mission. The snow was soft, and they sank to their waists. They climbed the same pass that had trapped the emigrants. On February 18th, they crested the summit. The scene that greeted them at the lake was one of utter desolation. The snow had buried the cabins completely. The rescuers had to shout to find them. When the human skeletons emerged from the holes in the snow, the rescuers were horrified. The emigrants were barely recognizable. Their hair was matted, their skin clung to their bones, and their eyes were hollow. Inside the cabins, the conditions were hellish. There was no sanitation. The smell was overpowering. But the rescuers had limited food. They could only take a few people back with them, those strong enough to walk. A heartbreaking selection process began. Families had to be split up. Margaret Reed had to choose which of her children would go and which would stay behind in the frozen hell. She chose to take 2 and leave 2, promising to send help back. Tamsin Donner, the brave teacher, refused to leave her husband, George. George was dying of an infection in his arm and couldn't walk. Tamsin looked at the rescuers and made her choice. She would send her children to safety, but she would stay and die with her husband. On February 22nd, the first relief party turned around and began the march back, leading a line of 23 refugees, mostly women and children. The journey out was a nightmare.
One of the children, little Ada Keseberg, died on the trail. Her mother was too weak to carry her body, so they buried her in the snow. Then John Denton, an Englishman, went blind from exhaustion. He sat down in the snow, told them to go on without him, and waited for death. But the worst was yet to come. As the first relief was struggling down the mountain with their group, they looked up and saw another group of men coming toward them. It was the second relief, led by James Reed. In the middle of the frozen wilderness, James Reed was reunited with his wife and two of his children. It was a moment of pure joy in a landscape of sorrow. But his joy was short-lived. He learned that his other two children were still back at the lake, starving. Reed pressed on toward the camps, determined to save the rest. But what he would find when he arrived at the lake this time would be far worse than what the first group had seen. The food brought by the first relief had run out days ago. The survivors left behind had grown weaker, and their hunger had grown stronger. When James Reed arrived at the cabins in early March, the silence was heavier. He climbed down into the Breen cabin and was greeted by a scene that would sear his soul. The bodies of the dead had been dragged out of the snow. They had been butchered. At the Donner camp at Alder Creek, things were even worse. Children were sitting on logs eating the half-roasted organs of their own relatives. The veneer of civilization had completely collapsed. It was no longer a wagon train. It was a charnel house. And yet the tragedy was not over. A third storm was brewing, a massive blizzard that would trap the second relief party in the mountains, creating an event known as Starved Camp, where the line between the living and the dead would blur completely. Part 3. The Starved Camp and the Final Horror. James Reed had finally returned. The man who had been banished into the wilderness was now the savior standing in the snow. It was March 3rd, 1847. Reed and his second relief party quickly gathered 17 survivors to trek back out. Among them were the Breen family, the Graves children, and Reed's own children who had been left behind. But at the Donner camp at Alder Creek, the situation was heartbreaking. George Donner was too weak to move. Tamsin Donner, though strong enough to walk, looked at her dying husband and then at James Reed. For the second time, she made the impossible choice. She wrapped her 3 little daughters in blankets and handed them to the rescuers. She whispered, "Save my children. I will stay." She turned back into the darkness of the tent to comfort her husband in his final days. It was the last time her children would ever see her. Reed and the 17 refugees marched away from the lake, but the Sierra Nevada was not done with them yet. 2 days into their journey, the sky turned black. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. A blizzard, more ferocious than any before, slammed into the mountain. They were caught in the open. They huddled together in a small depression in the snow, trying to keep a fire going, but the wind was relentless. This location would go down in history as Starved Camp. For 3 days the storm raged. The refugees were pinned down without food. The fire melted the snow beneath them, creating a 20-foot deep pit where they huddled, wet, freezing, and screaming in agony. Little Isaac Donner, just 5 years old, died in the pit. The hunger was so intense that the survivors, including children, consumed his body moments after he passed. Reed, seeing that they were all going to die, made a desperate decision. He took his own children and a few others who could still walk, and they scrambled out of the pit to make a run for help. They left behind 11 people in the bottom of that icy hole, mostly the Breen family and the Graves children. They were left with no food, no wood, and no hope. For days, the Breen family lay in the pit. Patrick Breen, the father, led them in prayer, his voice competing with the howling wind. Above them, on the rim of the pit, death waited. Just as the people in starved camp prepared to die, the third relief party appeared on the ridge. It was led by a man named John Stark. Stark was a giant of a man, big, strong, and possessed of an unwavering moral compass. When he looked down into the pit and saw the 11 survivors huddled around a fire made of dead bodies, the other rescuers with him hesitated. They said it was impossible to save them all. They suggested taking only the 2 strongest children and leaving the rest to die. John Stark looked at them and said, "No, I will not abandon them." What followed was a feat of superhuman strength. He didn't just guide them, he carried them. He would pick up a child, carry them a few hundred yards through the snow, put them down and go back for another. Then he would carry the bedding, then the provisions. He climbed the mountain 9 times that day. Because of John Stark, every single person left in starved camp survived. By April 1847, the snow finally began to melt. The tragedy was technically over for most, but there was one loose end. The 4th relief party was sent back to the lake one last time. Their mission was simple: salvage any goods left behind and check if by some miracle anyone was still alive. The scene they found at Alder Creek was silent. George Donner's body was there, wrapped in a sheet, but Tamsin Donner was gone. The rescuers moved to the cabins at the lake. They approached the Kesserberg cabin. The door creaked open. Inside, amidst a scene of absolute carnage, sat one man, Louis Kesserberg. He was the only survivor left at the lake. He was surrounded by half-eaten bodies. Pans on the fire were filled with human liver and lungs. The rescuers looked at him with suspicion. Kesserberg was a hard man, a man who had been accused of theft and violence earlier in the journey. They asked him where Tamsin Donner was. Kesserberg stared at them, his eyes wild. He told them that Tamsin Donner had arrived at his cabin late one night, delirious and freezing, after George had died. He claims she died naturally that night.
"And then?" the rescuers asked. "And then," Kesserberg said, "I ate her." The rescuers were repulsed. They found buckets of Tamsin's blood in the cabin. They found her family's money in Kesserberg's pocket. They accused him of murdering her for the food and the gold. Kesserberg denied it until his dying day, claiming he only did what he had to do to survive. They dragged him out of the cabin, leaving the horrors behind. Kesserberg was the last member of the Donner Party to be rescued. On April 29, 1847, the last survivor came down the mountain. The statistics are grim. Of the 87 people who entered the mountains, only 48 survived. 39 died. 2/3 of the women and children survived, while 2/3 of the men died. The men had worked themselves to death trying to clear the path, while the women's bodies were biologically better suited to withstand long-term starvation. The Pioneer Palace car was never seen again. The dreams of a quick route to riches were buried under 20 feet of snow. The Donner Party tragedy became a dark legend in American history. It served as a grim warning to the thousands who would follow during the gold rush just a year later. Respect the land, respect the weather, and never, ever take a shortcut through the unknown. Today, if you drive on Interstate 80 through the Sierra Nevada, you will pass Donner Lake. It is a beautiful, serene vacation spot. People ski on the slopes where the Forlorn Hope marched. They picnic near the spot where the Murphy cabin stood. But on quiet winter nights, when the wind howls through the Truckee Pass and the snow begins to pile up against the pine trees, you can almost hear them. The creaking of wagon wheels, the crying of children, and the silence, the terrible silence of the snow.